is a great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, which I will still be doing a lot of that over the next year. Dr. Jill Derby, actually I met in the spring. She was invited to be a guest speaker at the Academy's National Character and Leadership Symposium. And we enjoyed a wonderful informal dinner together and immediately thought that we needed to bring her back. She is a fourth generation Nevadan. I didn't realize that until I found that out on Wikipedia last night, so there you are. There are Derby dams and Derby roads and Derby all sorts of things in Nevada if you're around in that part of the world. But she didn't stay there. She lived and worked in the Middle East for a number of years as a young college graduate. She learned Arabic. She then went back to the University of California, Davis, and earned a PhD in cultural anthropology with a focus on Middle Eastern cultures. She went back to Nevada. She spent 18 years, as an elected member of the Board of Regents of the state of Nevada, serving 3 terms as its board chair. Then she ran a close race as a Democrat in Nevada, go figure. And nobody figured she would get anywhere, and actually on the eve of it, kind of like Truman and Dewey, she was actually ahead, and then those pesky absentee ballots came in. And she found she wasn't there. But in the process really instigated a women's movement in politics that still carries on in the state of Nevada. And she has since remained as a consultant in higher education governance, which 3 years ago, 2 years ago, 4 years ago, when did you go to Suleiman? 2 years ago, 2+ years ago, she was invited to join the board of the American University in Iraq, in Suleimani, in the Kurdish portions of Iraq, and she is currently the vice chair of that board. It's a critical institution in the life of Iraq, and the timing of this presentation couldn't be better because we've actually had reason to rediscover where Kurdistan is in the last few months. So without any further ado, please join me in welcoming to this podium Dr. Jill Derby.
Thank you, Sky. It's just a delight to return to Colorado Springs, and a particular delight to be with you at the World Affairs Council. I have to tell you that I love World Affairs Councils and Foreign Affairs Councils, whatever they're called, when I run across them. After living abroad and coming back to this country, I was disappointed to find that so many Americans know very little about international affairs or other parts of the world for a lot of different kinds of reasons, big ponds on each side of the country, and I could expound on that but won't. But as a matter of fact, it's just the way it is. We're more insular because of where we live and how our history has unfolded. So it's always a delight for me to be able to join with people who are interested in what's going on around the world and really devote their time and energies to these sorts of gatherings, inviting in speakers in order to be informed, because it's so important to be informed on the international stage, and it's not so easy to do without joining with others who are interested as well. So I just appreciate and acknowledge all of you for your interest in what's going on in the world. And today my topic is Kurdistan. I often will speak with PowerPoints in order to sort of lay out maps that people can reference, because when you're talking about other parts of the world, you just say names and people lose them entirely. But Sky informed me that PowerPoint doesn't work very well here, so what we did instead, with Sky's good help, is Sky printed out a 6-page flyer of some slides that I would have been using, particularly with some maps to help reference as I talked. And I want to tell you how my talk will go, and then I'm really looking forward to your questions at the end of the time. I want to start by giving you just a little bit of an orientation about where Kurdistan is, where Iraq is, who the Kurds are, a bit of a background about that. And then I want to really emphasize 4 themes over the course of walking you through 100 years of history. Because in order to understand what's happening today, you have to understand the last 100 years of history in the Middle East, and that means after World War I. And I'll try to do that briefly and let you know the significant events that happened, particularly in that part of the world. But the themes that I want to really touch on are that legacy of World War I and how it has so dominated the events that have unfolded in the region ever since. In order, as I said, to understand the Middle East and all that's happened over this time period and is happening today, one needs to understand the history and what followed World War I. I want to talk a bit about all the broken promises to the Kurds, who were promised a number of times an autonomous and independent state of their own, and those promises got broken. We were part of breaking those promises, as the Western powers were. But I also want to mention the Kurds' relentless efforts over this time period to establish their own independent homeland. And finally, I want, as a theme, to help you understand, as we walk through the history, what it is about Iraq that has enabled the Kurds to establish an autonomous and independent region of their own, government of their own, if you will, in northern Iraq, because that's essentially, when we talk about the autonomous Kurdish region in northern Iraq, yes, it's part of Iraq, but it has its own government called the Kurdish Regional Government, and its own military forces, and a lot of the kinds of appendages of statehood themselves. And that didn't happen in Turkey, that didn't happen in Iran, didn't happen in Syria, but it happened in Iraq, and you'll see that there are reasons for that. So with that kind of introduction, if you look, I know on your tables you have these handouts, and you have the maps, and so I will refer to them. I think that it's helpful on page 1 is just a couple of maps of Iraq, but what I wanted to point to on that first map, because I'll be referring to some of these places. As Skye mentioned, I'm now on the board of the American University of Iraq in Suleimania, and Suleimania figures very importantly in Kurdish history and the history of the Kurdish region. Erbil you've been hearing a lot about lately, because we all worried a month or so ago whether or not the ISIS forces were going to head into Erbil, which would have been a very serious kind of really incursion into what is Kurdistan. And it didn't happen, and I never thought for a minute that the U.S. would allow it to happen. But you'll also be hearing about Kirkuk, which the Kurds have always regarded as part of their traditional and natural homeland area, but the Iraqi central government has never agreed to that. So it's always been contentious. It's a multi-ethnic place, but there are a lot of Kurds there. There are also Iraqi Arabs there, both Sunni and Shia, and other ethnic groups as well. But you would have, if you had been paying attention to the news, you would have heard a couple of months ago when the Iraqi army pulled back in the onslaught of ISIS, how the Kurdish Peshmerga, which is the name of their militias, took Kirkuk. And for the Kurds, that was like huge, because they have always felt this is part of their natural and traditional homeland, in fact, a center point of it, and have been very frustrated that the Iraqi central government has never agreed to that. And so we're waiting to see what will happen, but that's an important place. So, and then on one of those maps, you can see, the second map, you'll see Dohuk up in the northeast corner of the Kurdish Autonomous Region, and that's always been really a very central part for the KRG. There are two political parties that dominate in Kurdistan in the Kurdish Regional Government, and they are the KRP and the PUK. I'll talk more about those and how they developed and all that's going on currently. But as I said earlier, you can't understand what's going on currently unless we walk through almost 100 years of history, because if we go back, and as you know, we've been celebrating or memorializing, honoring the start of World War I, a centennial celebration really, although you don't really think of a celebration in terms of war, but it's been 100 years since World War I started in 1914. Concluded in 1918, so really it's almost 100 years. But here's what you need to know. Let me just say a word or two more about the Kurds to sort of follow my outline here a little bit more. On that second page, it does lay out for you where the Kurdish region is in the yellow there. And you can look at that and you can see, oh, a big chunk of Turkey You see they're in northern Iraq, they're western Iran, and then that little bit of Syria. So that is what we consider Kurdistan. As you know, it's not an independent state, and it is a group of people, 25, 30 million people that have historically lived in that part of the world. And we're talking about his history probably going back to the earliest days of Mesopotamia, some say 2400 BC. They started being called the Kurds about the 7th century, when in fact the Islamists, the Arabs invaded, the Kurds converted to Sunni Islam, and the Arabs adopted this name of Kurds for them. But they've been living in those mountains for centuries. Traditionally pastoral people, sheep and goats and so forth. But after World War I, when the nation states were drawn up by the British and the French, they lost the ability to migrate to different pastures across national boundaries. And so they could no longer really pursue pastoralism and became farmers instead. They're mostly Sunni Arabs, and they've been where they live a long time. And for a lot of that time, they have wanted to have their own independent region. They have, although they converted to Islam, they have a very distinct culture, their own language they have, which is similar to Farsi, not to Arabic, and those are the Kurds. So what happened in World War I is that the Turks fought for the Ottoman Empire and lost. And the Ottoman Empire, which had been in existence for 6 centuries, a very long time, and under which the Kurds in that region lived, was defeated. The British and French, and you probably are familiar with this history, under the Sykes-Picot Treaty, decided to divide up the Middle East. And if you look at page 3, you'll see, number 1, that top map shows you the Ottoman Empire was very large. I mean, for so much of its history, it went across North Africa, in fact, and it was Southeast Asia, rather Central Asia and Southeast Europe. Very, very large empire. Anyway, the Ottomans lost. The British and the French decided that they would divide up the region. And if you look at the map on the bottom, you see that the British established their mandates in Iraq, in Transjordan, and in Palestine. The French took Syria and Lebanon. And I won't go into North Africa because that isn't so central to our conversation. And so that's the way they divided things up. And in fact, in 1920, they set out a Treaty of Sèvres, it was called, that set these boundaries and established the state of Iraq according to the boundaries that were there. Interestingly, though, the Turks weren't going for it. And they, under the leadership of Kemal, and you would have heard him referenced before, they ended up calling him Ataturk, because that means father of Turkey. They revolted, and they actually forced the occupying armies out, and then could come to the table and say, we reject that treaty, I want another treaty, and we want a treaty that establishes Turkey as an independent nation. Now, the only sad things for the Kurds was in the initial Treaty of Sèvres, that was 1920, it had demarcated an autonomous homeland for the Kurds, established that. It was part of that treaty. But it was part of what Turkey really wouldn't settle for. And so they fought a very tough battle throughout the occupiers, the Western powers that were in Turkey, and got their way. So the Treaty of Lausanne that was established in 1923 established Turkey as a republic, and Ataturk came in as the president. But Iraq, Iran, and Turkey all said no way to a Kurdish homeland. And that's really when Kurdistan got divided into the 4 countries that you see it today: Iraq, Iran, Turkey, and Syria. But it was that was one of their first moments when it looked like they would have a homeland. I want to just take you really quickly through a little bit what happened in Turkey, and then we're going to move over to what happened in Iraq, touch on Iran a little bit too, because it's important as we march through these next years. Well, in 1925, the Kurds in Turkey absolutely revolted and had quite an uprising. They thought they were going to get a homeland, and all of a sudden here they are under the Turks. And they were defeated by the Turkish army, and it began 80 years of suppression of the Kurds in Turkey. They suppressed, the Turkish government did not recognize them as a minority group at all, sought to suppress their culture, their language, their traditions, and that started in 1923, and the first rebellion was in 1925. And so they were really pretty severely suppressed. It became illegal to even speak Kurdish, and they lived with that. And you know, if we were to follow the history forward, in 1978, a guy named Abdullah Öcalan came forward and established the PKK, the Workers' Party, the Kurdish Workers' Party, and advocated independence for the Kurdish minority in Turkey. And you know, Turkey said there's no way this is going to happen. It began conflict that has lasted for decades, and a lot of violence, 40,000 people killed, Kurds, Turks, civilians, and you would have read about all those incidents in the paper. Anyway, in 1999, the Turkish government managed to capture Öcalan, who is down, I think, in Kenya somewhere. Now, for 20 years, he had remained free and the active leader of the PKK, and with all their efforts. They put him in prison. They actually pronounced the death sentence on him, but the EU put a lot of pressure on them to abolish the death penalty, and Turkey was interested, as you know, at that time and forward in joining the EU, and so they commuted his sentence, put him in jail, kept him in prison, in fact, on an island, I forget the name of it, all by himself. They evacuated all the other prisoners, and it was just he. And then, just going forward in Turkey, what happened in 2006, Öcalan wrote a lot of books in prison, and he still was very well-known figure. He renounced violence and said what we need is a political solution to this. And so there's been, since that time, a kind of rapprochement, and it's been off and on, between the Turkish government and the Kurds. And amazingly, when I was attending the graduation ceremony at our university in Kurdistan in Suleymaniye, the Turkish foreign minister came to our university and spoke briefly and spoke in Kurdish. And people were almost in tears because it represented such a huge shift in the attitude of the Turks towards the Kurds. So it's a little bit on and off, and during this whole period, I should tell you that the Iraqi Kurds have been offering sanctuary to the Turkish PKK fighters in the mountains of Iraq, and so Turkey has continually come in and bombed and, gone after them in northern Iraq. The Kurds have a sense of solidarity. Both Iran and Turkey have been fiercely opposed to any kind of independent state for the Kurds, or even the autonomous government they have up in Iraq, which is not an independent state, but it's certainly autonomous. They have their own government, a lot of independence, and so on and so forth. The Iranians, the Turks have always been very much opposed to it, and even into 2007, 8, 9, up to 11, they were still coming in with their airplane and bombing, particularly because there were PKK fighters in there. So just a sense of how that works and why, over the years, there's been such resistance to the Kurds having their own independent homeland. The same thing happened again after World War II. But with all their neighbors opposed to it, there was no way that the Western powers were going to support the Kurds' effort for an independent homeland. So let me go over to Iraq now, because that's what happened in Turkey all the way up to present. But what's going on in Iraq is that the British established their mandate, then they imposed a king on Iraq, decided it would be a kingdom, the Kingdom of Iraq, and they imposed King Faisal. Now, what you should know about King Faisal is that he's a Hashemite. They're Sunni Arabs, but the Hashemite tribes had been very supportive of the British as they were fighting. As some of you remember, I hope a lot of you saw Lawrence of Arabia, so you know that whole history. And Lawrence, who was an officer in the British military and learned Arabic and befriended people, and he really led and helped organize the Arabs to throw out the Turks. And Faisal had been the emir of Mecca, and in the movie, or in Seven Pillars of Wisdom, which is Lawrence's book, you would read that he and Lawrence fought side by side. and were really kind of joint commanders of the Arab legions that ended up expelling the Turks from all those Arab homelands. So anyway, Heshmite's a good friend of the British, and so as you know, King Hussein, the original King Hussein, it was originally King Abdullah who was assassinated, then King Hussein, and now his son Abdullah, all Heshmites. And so they imposed Faisal over in Iraq. Well, here's the problem with when they drew all those boundaries around Iraq, was that they didn't even consider consulting with the people that were going to be part of that state that they were developing. So up in the north, you had the Kurds, you had Assyrians, you have the Yazidis. We've been hearing about the Yazidis lately, and they all rebelled. The British had their forces in there, and they suppressed that rebellion. The Shias in the south, they rebelled as well. I mean, nobody agreed to this. And I mention that because as you follow the history forward in Iraq, one of the reasons that the Kurds have been successful in northern Iraq is because there's been a lot of political instability in Iraq, because there was never an agreement with all those people to begin with that they should be part of a nation state called Iraq. Now, they've made it work. I don't mean that they've never made it work, but there have always been those tensions there. So the British installed King Faisal, and he ruled until, I think 1933 was when the British mandate ended. The monarchy remained, and the British stayed there, and they were really very much in charge of the place, picking the prime minister, the president, et cetera, and that was the case clear until 1958, when it wasn't the first time the Iraqis had revolted and tried to get the British out, but they were successful at that time. So it was the end of the monarchy, and Abdul Qasim came in and declared the Republic of Iraq, and that was in 1958. But really a lot had been happening in the meantime that you need to know about, because you've been hearing lately about Barzani, who is a big figure in what's going on in Kurdistan these days. And what the Kurds in Iraq continue to really resist and try to have more independence and resist the Iraqi government. And there were a number of uprisings that happened. In 1945, Mustafa Barzani led a revolt against the central government in Iraq, was defeated and fled to Iran. And this is sort of reflects for you a close tie between the Kurds and Iran that has existed for a very long time historically, in all these troubles that have gone on. So I would ask you to look over to page 4 here, and down at the bottom you see something called the Mahabad Republic of Iran that I'm sure nobody knows about unless you really study the region. But Barzani, with his troops, having been thrown out of Iraq, defeated and ran over to Iran, and then they helped establish an independent Kurdish republic in Iran. And you see in the map where that is, it's really kind of a long stretch there that goes north of Iran and right along the side of Azerbaijan. Well, here's the thing, they had the support of the Soviets, because the Soviets, who actually weren't interested in an independent Kurdistan, it turns out, supported them because they wanted to kind of include all that area. Now, mind you, this is after World War II. They wanted to include Azerbaijan and get as much territory as they could, so they supported the Kurds. Yes, let's fight and establish this and get the Iranian army out, and then the Soviets saw that they could absorb it. But actually, when it became clear that Barzani and the troops that were the main forces for this Mahabad Republic, only lasted a year, said, we're not doing that, we want our own independent land, and the Soviets withdrew their support. We agreed, by the way, with the Soviets. The US said, yeah, we can't have that independent Kurdistan, it just causes too much trouble, none of the neighbors want it, and so on and so forth. So Barzani and his troops, many of them, fled with him up into the Soviet Union, which they were friendly with and which took them in exile. Some of the officers that were part of that went back to Iraq and were executed. So Barzani and his troops stayed out of Iraq then until 1958. So when the monarchy was thrown out, the British had to go. The independent Republic of Iraq was established as a republic, and Qasim was the head of it. Qasim invited Barzani back. He had been out for almost 15 years, I think it was. So then, just to follow a little bit historically what happened in 1961, Kuwait was given its independence, and Iraq immediately claimed it. You have to understand that Iraq always thought, if you look at a map, one of those first maps you had seen, and you see right where Kuwait is, you can understand why Iraq always thought it was part of their natural territory. I mean, they go clear down to the Gulf, and I'm trying to think. If you look at that first page and the map of Iraq, you can see how Kuwait is sort of carved out. Well, of course the Allies carved it out. There's a lot of oil in Kuwait, and they wanted to keep that for themselves. But the Iraqis always considered it part of their own. I only mentioned that because it helps you understand why did Saddam Hussein in 1990 decide to invade Kuwait. And there's some history to that they had, the Iraqi government always considered it part of their natural territory. In 1961, what happened was it began a decade when the Kurds under Barzani and the Peshmerga, which is the name of their militias, their army, took on the Iraqi army. And it was just a decade of fighting. Probably 100,000 people died. And it was kind of a standoff, but at the end of the day, near 1970, the Soviets intervened and really pushed the Iraqi government to accept Barzani, to give the Kurds some more autonomy, and call it off, because nobody had really gotten anywhere. And one of the problems was, in one of the big battles, Barzani prevailed, and so he had a pretty tough army. Some of this was over Kirkuk. Barzani said, no, this belongs to the Kurds, and the Iraqi government never signed off on that. But anyway, so many people died. It was a bitter, bitter war during that time. Then you will remember very clearly 1979, which was when there was an Iranian Revolution. And in the Iranian Revolution was when, our embassy was taken hostage and so forth. So we felt very bitterly about Iran. A couple things happened. One, the Kurds in the northwestern Iran rose up in revolt to establish their own place, their autonomous homeland again. And the Iranians, even though they were in the midst of that, their own revolution and all that turmoil, they came in and put down the Kurds. So, just another time where this group, the Iranian Kurds, had thought, this is our time, we're going for it, and they were really suppressed and didn't make it. What happened, though, is the Kurds supported the Iranians. It was a bitter war. The Iraqis, I should tell you that the Ba'ath Party had come in the just about 1970s, and as you know, the Ba'aths ruled in Iraq going forward clear until 2003. But Saddam Hussein came into power. I think he was the third Ba'athist leader, came into power and in 1979, just at the time that the Iranian Revolution happened. And he has all these Shias in the south. Remember, this state was put together with all this mix of ethnic groups that had always almost felt more loyalty to their own ethnic group than they had to the central state of Iraq. So there were the Shias in the south, with the support of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, fomented a revolt. And that's where Iraq declared war, went into Iran. It was an 8-year war, at least 1 million people. It was a brutal, brutal war, probably 1 million people killed in that war. The Kurds supported Iran. Now you can get that didn't sit well with Saddam Hussein. They were up there in the north, so they weren't right in the pitch of battle or anything, but they supported Iran. So when that war in 1988 came to an end, Saddam Hussein directed his fury at the Kurds in the north. And it was something called the Anfal, A-N-F-A-L, Anfal campaign, which is just a watermark in the history of the Kurds. Because he just was going to drive the Kurds out of northern Iraq. And he, through a year of a brutal campaign that did involve chemical warfare, but went after village to get them out, and ultimately defeated and abolished 45,000 Kurdish villages up there in the north. A lot of people lived in villages, and Assyrians as well. It's a multi-ethnic area, and the Assyrians have tended to agree with the Kurds. Anyway, 1.5 million people driven out. They went into the hills, they went over to Turkey, and so forth. Then you know that Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in 1990. We drove him out, and at the same time we established with the British, and the Turks helped as well with this one, a no-fly zone over the part of Iraq that is Kurdistan, above the 36th parallel. and we protected it. It was called a campaign of Find Comfort or something like that. It's a little bit off. But anyway, we flew over it. So the Iraqi army was driven out south of that 36th parallel, and the Kurds were protected. They all came back, as many as that were still alive, and a lot of them were, like, hundreds of thousands of Kurds then came back to their homeland in northern Iraq. In 1992, they established the Kurdish Regional Government, their own government. They had this safe space that they've had ever since, and they started building a nation. Now, I should have told you that back in 1975, a guy named Jalal Talabani broke with the KDP, which was Barzani's party, because he said it's just way too tribal, and it's there just wasn't much of a chance for anybody that wasn't part of that large Barzani family to rise to leadership. So that's where you ended up with two parties in Kurdistan. 1975, Jalal Talabani. Now, he still heads the party, although he had a stroke a few years ago and is very incapacitated. The Barzani you read about is the son of Mustafa Barzani, who was exiled into Iran, that rose up continually against the central government and so forth. So you can see it's really, the KDP is really very much of a family affair, and that's the Barzanis. And then the Talibanis established the PUK, which is the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan. So when they started government, 1992, protected by the no-fly zone, they all came back. Okay, now we really have our own place. They elected a government. It was a real even split between the two parties. To avoid conflict, they sort of had one from each party to head a ministry. So it's very much an interesting sort of setup. They each had their own militia, which are called their Peshmerga. They each had their own, and they kept them separate. This is important to understand because it's still the case today that each of those parties has their own militias, their own Peshmerga, and they wear a little bit different uniforms so you can recognize them when you're driving around. So that was really cool. They set up the ministry, the whole thing, the parliament. It was all going good, and then in 1994, they had a civil war. It didn't work so well about this division. So in 1996, what they did is they established two Kurdistans. They had in Suleimania, where the American University of Iraq is, was really the PUK headquarters. Barham Saleh was the prime minister over there, and he's currently the chair of our board, by the way. And then you had up in Erbil, or really in Dohuk, initially, you had Barzani and the KDP, and they just were two separate places. They had, two separate administrations, and that's just the way they did it. In 1998, Madeleine Albright and some others came in and said, you guys got to stop fighting, this is stupid. And so there was a peace plan. And they came back together, but they couldn't really, the competition is so strong that they couldn't really bring it back together. So they continued with this arrangement until 2006, where you had really these two administrative districts that was really under the KRG, which is the Kurdish Regional Government. And it was a pretty crazy arrangement, but they couldn't really bring it together, and they each kept their own Peshmerga, their own security people, and their own finances. Now, just really quickly, because I want to wind this up very quickly, is during the UN put very strict sanctions on Iraq, but it became clear that it was so severe that people were dying of starvation, and it was just horrible what was going on in Iraq. So established we'll trade oil for food and medicine kind of program eventually. And that agreement that the US and the UN really struck, and it was a UN resolution, said that the Kurds should get 13% of oil revenues. And in terms of the food and the medicine and the other kinds of supplies. So it was established at that point that the Kurds up there in the KRG get that 13%. And then, of course, these two have to decide how to divide that up. Just always been a lot of tension around that. But I mention that because right now what's happened is with the Kurds and their great sense of independence, decided to independently ship oil through Turkey to sell it outside of the Iraqi central government. And the government of Maliki said, you can't do that, that's against the Constitution. and the Kurds did it anyway. And then the central government, Maliki, cut off their 13%. Now I know about this because this affects our university. We get a kind of subsidy from the KRG, and they all of a sudden weren't getting any money. So that brings us really up to the present. In 2006, finally, this was after 10 years of these two separate governments, they came together and formed a unity government. But they still kept their separate Peshmerga forces, their separate security forces, and they still had this arrangement where you had sort of whoever, there was a minister of one KDP, then you had the PUK was the deputy minister or something like that. So it's been complicated. Just quickly, then what happened just a couple of years ago is that the PUK got splintered, and a party called the Goran Party splintered off because they felt that these two parties that were all about family, the Talibanis, the Barzanis, nobody has a chance and they aren't moving fast enough. We want progressive change. The Goran broke off, so there are really three parties. And then in the latest election, just earlier this year, they really gained a lot of seats in parliament. So just interesting kinds of things going on. I think I'll stop there, but I want to go back to my original themes, and I probably left a few things out in that history. But that sort of generally shows you that what happened in Turkey, what happened in Iraq, what was going on over in Iran. I should tell you an interesting anecdote, though, is in that civil war that the Kurds had, 1994 to 1998. In 1996, the KDP, Barzani's group, did not have Erbil. The PUK had both Sulaymaniyah and Erbil. Barzani's group called in Saddam Hussein and his army to come in and throw the PUK out of Erbil, and from then on they really had, Erbil was the KDP place. They're a little ashamed of that, and they talk about it as an unfortunate necessity or something like that. At the same time, the PUK called their friends from Iran, and Iran came in to support the PUK to make sure they kept at least Sulaymaniyah. So you sort of see how it all works. It's been an interesting history. So, but because of all the fighting and all their efforts for independence, that's why their Peshmerga are well-trained fighters. And when you've read about, those statements in the paper about their tough fighters. They're tough fighters because they've had to be their whole history. Somebody's come in and dominated. Some of them, it's first the Arabs and then the Seljuk Turks and then the Mongols and then the Persians. They were always dominated, and so they developed themselves, mountain people, fierce warriors, and so forth. And it's why we turned to them to be the fighters that really helped us push back ISIS. I think I'll stop there because you probably have a lot of questions, and I think it'd be more productive for me to answer your questions, but I'll wait to see what you have to ask.
Thank you very much for that wonderful thing. That's a note I got to remember to take.
Okay, got it.
All right, you got all that to be a quiz. David?
Yeah.
No, very timely question. What should we do about ISIS? Should we go in? Do they need our help? What should we do? Do we look to others?
Well, let me give you my sense of that, and I follow this pretty closely, but I think we're doing the right thing about ISIS, and that is, it was so appropriate that we came in when we did over what was going on with the Yazidis and what was going on, the threat to Erbil and so on and so forth, but I think we've got it right in terms of troops on the ground need to be the folks in that region, that's their neighborhood, and we got to support them. I think that Obama did the right thing, and I don't say that as a Democrat, but the right thing in holding off until Maliki stepped aside, because with Maliki, that country was never going to come together. The Sunnis were never going to agree unless Maliki stepped aside. Because the Sunnis, who for the most part are generally moderate, and certainly in that reason they are, only aligned themselves with ISIS because it was the better of two very bad choices. Ideologically, they don't agree, and were that to go forward, there's going to be a lot of trouble with that. But so I think we're all encouraged that Maliki stepped aside. Now we've got a body. He's just yesterday put together most of a government that expresses some unity. He brought in some Kurds. He brought in some Sunnis in important positions in ministries. And now we're in a better position to support them and their military. One of the things I like to add, I didn't share this, but this relates to the Iraqi military, because this really didn't come out very much, and I didn't think it was fair. We did such a great job of training the Iraqi military, but when Maliki came in, he decided that he wanted a loyal group rather than a real military. He didn't want to have to worry about a coup d'etat, so he took out all these professionals that were the leaders in the army and put in his cronies who didn't know anything about the military. Now, I'm simplifying that, but a lot of people don't realize that's what happened. When the Iraqi army fell apart and left, it wasn't because they were cowards, but they didn't trust their leaders, who were really just Maliki's cronies and not militarily trained people and professional soldiers, to really manage their defense. And they thought, I'm not putting my life on the line for these guys. So I just like to point that out, because I know many of you here in the military. And it made the Iraqi army look bad, but you have to understand, we did some great work over there. But he had fired all the people that weren't his closest friends, and the ones that were Sunnis or that he couldn't count on, because he didn't want to worry about a coup. And that's what resulted in just an army that couldn't hold up. So I just strayed in answering your questions. But I think we're on the right path, working with those people in the region and supporting them and sending them supplies and getting the world community, and we're all in agreement on this, to support them, and it's going to take some time, but I know we can do it.
Question really, couple parts of the question really relating to U.S. relationships to the Kurds. Historically, why did we not support the Kurds when Saddam Hussein went after them? And then the second, and then the more recent part of that question is, are we looking to the Kurds to play a special role, or a sole role? How do we view the Kurds as a bulwark against ISIS?
Help me keep on track for the second part of that, because the first part of that, what I want to say is, one of the tragedies was that after in the early Desert Storm War, when we pushed Saddam Hussein back, we encouraged the Kurds and the Shias down in the south to rise up and revolt, and we wanted them to overthrow Saddam Hussein. But they thought we would support them in that, and we didn't. And they paid an enormous price for that. As you know, the onslaught against the Kurds with the chemical warfare and all the rest of it was part of that. But down in the south, Saddam Hussein drained the marshes, and the marsh Arabs that lived down there for centuries and centuries, all of a sudden, were really decimated and had to leave the area. So, and they brutally suppressed both the Shias in the south and the Kurds in the north. And the second part of the question was?
Us and the Kurds now.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's who there was to fight when all of a sudden ISIS was marching in and heading towards Erbil, because they are an organized fighting force, and the Iraqi army had shown itself missing in action. But it won't be what we will count on entirely going forward. We will continue to support them, supply them with weapons and so forth. Here's the interesting thing that's been hard for the Kurds, and a little bit hard for some of us that are working up there, is the American government, the US government, has had a one Iraqi policy. And we have not been willing to support the Kurds' autonomy or the Kurds' independence. So we've just stayed out of that. We've always said Iraq must maintain its one-state status, and we're sticking with that. So what we will do is, I think, support the Iraqi government now in building up their army, helping to train, and getting that back to be a fighting force, because it's their territory. And I think we'll do the same with other allies in the region. I hear Jordan mentioned, and Jordan's always maintained a very solid and active military, and they're a good ally. Turkey, we'll see if Turkey weighs in on that one too. I mean, it's their neighborhood. That's where the danger is, and the world is united in horror at this group, ISIS, and so are all those people, by the way. And everybody's terrified of them, and with reason. So that's what I'd say, is we will start now much more actively working with the Iraqi government, helping them build up their forces and continue to support the Kurds. That's how I would see it going.
How would you rank geography, ethnicity, and religion as drivers in the region? I don't know if all of the above is an allowable answer.
Yeah, because I was thinking all of the above fits, but you're looking for how you would rank them. And interestingly, I wouldn't put religion first. I would tend to put geography and ethnicity up there. I mean, if you look over the course of the history, there's been a great loyalty to ethnicity among the various groups, more so than loyalty to nation states that they had no say in establishing. And that's very strong. And you know, the ancient history of the Middle East is one that's very tribal, and those ties are very strong. You know, with religion, what you see is there's so much, and a lot of Americans don't understand this, there's great diversity in Islam. And there are so many sects that Islam is divided into, and so on and so forth. And all those people have lived together pretty well over ages. You know, respecting other religions. In fact, Islam, part of their scripture, talks about people of the book, and the Christians and the Jews are people of the book, the Old Testament. And we can all live together because we're all the people of the book. But other kinds of economics enters into it. Certainly geography enters into it. I mean, you have to look at oil and the role that oil plays in all of this. I mean, why is there a fight over Kirkuk? Well, there are a lot of oil wells around Kirkuk. So it's hard to rank them, and at different times maybe different ones of those, different elements play a stronger role. And sometimes people who are the leaders manipulate religion in order to have that be a factor to rally people to a certain cause, unfortunately. But I think geography and the kind of economic influences are very big, and there's also a strong sense of ethnic loyalty. Look at the Kurds, they've hung together a long time.
Yes, sir. We have two arguments here. One is we want to support a united Iraq, so we have a one Iraq policy, but we have a history that points to I'll just say an autonomous, certainly a sense of independence in Kurdistan, but a crossing of the line when the Kurds decided that they were just going to send oil on their own pipeline through Turkey and to heck with Baghdad. So is this the first step? I'm paraphrasing your question, but is this the first step towards an independent Kurdistan, or was this, okay, that went over the line, back off?
Well, we didn't support that move, and if you followed the rest of the story, nobody would buy the oil, and the oil ended up floating around in the ocean in tankers because of the pressure that was put on everybody not to buy that. I mean, we have really stuck to that one Iraq policy, and I don't see any signs that we're ready to give that up. The truth is the other neighbors don't want to see an independent Kurdistan. Don't forget, Turkey has a huge population of Kurds over there in the east. Iran in the northwest has a big population of Kurds. Syria is not a factor to be considered here, but so there hasn't been a lot of support for an independent Kurdistan other than in Kurdistan. And I have to tell you, and just talking with people when I've been there over the last couple of years, it's a little bit mixed, because while it just sort of, they've had this passion for centuries and they're on the brink of, but some of them said, you know, we have had the best of all worlds because we have our own government here. We get funding from the central government of Iraq that helps us, and we have, you know, if you go to Kurdistan today, it is booming. It's a flourishing place. I mean, you see cranes everywhere with high rises. In fact, the dinner we had after graduation was at a hotel in Suleimania that looked like something out of Las Vegas. So it's really over these a couple of decades that they've been independent, it's peaceful, it's stable, it's invited investment, and it's just, you know, it's raising the standard of everybody living there, amazing from what it was back in the 80s, let's say. So in some ways they have the best possible world, and the kind of enmity they're going to incur by demanding independence, and whether they could sustain that if they don't have the support of the neighborhood, or probably so far our support. We've stuck with our one Iraq policy. So even though they love to talk it, and when it put a lot of pressure on Maliki and on the central government when they were saying, we're going independent, if you guys don't get it together and include some of us in your government, but you had the feeling maybe that was more rhetoric for the pressure it was putting on the central government to get Maliki out and get a unity government involved. So they may have a plebiscite and vote for it. I think that would definitely pass, because that's sort of part of Kurd identity is that independence, but I don't see it in the near future.
You have time? Yes, ma'am. You get left. In terms of fighting ISIS, and particularly as it spills over into Syria, and I think something that's been implicit but not explicit is that the boundary between Syria and Iraq is something you see on a map but has no other significance. How do you deal with ISIS within Syria, and how do you tell one set of dissidents apart from another? How do you tell people apart?
Well, I think it may be easier to tell them apart, but if I had the answer to that, I would call the president because he's going to be talking tomorrow about it. It's very tough. I mean, it was one thing when they were in their coming in columns, heading towards Erbil or getting the Yazidis up on the mountain, and they were out there exposed, and we could go in with planes and their targets. But they're very embedded now in like Raqqa, which is their capital in Syria, very embedded with the population now. And you know, here's what I have to say, a lot of those populations that are Sunni Arab, mostly because everybody else gets out of the way, they're so brutal and vicious, they're gonna just go with the program right now because it's dangerous going against that group. So once now that ISIS gets back and embedded in those towns and villages and cities like Raqqa, I think it's very tough. That's why I think it's so important that it's probably going to be a multi-pronged strategy where we build up and support the militaries in the region that can be the foot soldiers that go in and start figuring out. And see, we haven't had good intelligence in the area either. Do you know, if we only knew where this guy Baghdadi was, who is the head of ISIS, and we could go in the way we did with Osama bin Laden, but we don't have that kind of intelligence in that group. That's something that you all know takes years to build up, and we just haven't done that. So it's a pretty big challenge, but one I hear that really most of the world is committed to, and it's going to take, I think, a multifaceted strategy that recognizes that once they're embedded in cities and towns, it's going to be tough.
Bob, quite apart from external pressures on the Kurds, can the Kurds, as we go forward, can the Kurds live within the existing constitutional structure in Iraq, or do they have does the elite within the political leaders within Kurdish Iraq believe that they need to have particular revisions to the constitution, or is there nothing in this constitution they really want and it's got to be the whole loaf of Kurdish independence?
Well, remember, they have really lived for over 20 years now inside Iraq as an autonomous region that has its own separate government, receiving funds from the Iraqi government. And there are things in that Iraqi constitution that they would change and would want to change, and we'll see what kind of negotiating power they have. I mean, they definitely want to keep Kirkuk. Will the Iraqi central government agree with that? They would like to be independently just market their oil. I don't know if the central government would agree with that. So it may be one of these kind of negotiations, but we'll see what happens. But it's hard to imagine that the Kurds would go ahead to be an independent state in a neighborhood that nobody wants them to be independent, and when the major Western powers aren't supportive of that, nor do I think is Russia. So I think that they will try from a position of greater strength to negotiate better conditions. But, you know, many people have called for a kind of federation in Iraq. You've heard this. Biden did it years ago, that what you really need is maybe, it's a federation means you're part of Iraq, but you have the kind of autonomy that the Kurds have, and that other areas could have that kind of autonomy as well, but there would still be a central government, and there seems to be support for that. But I think there's so much that's uncertain and that is unfolding day to day that it's hard to know. I would only say the Kurds can be passionate in their hearts about independence, but then when it gets very practical about how is this really going to work, because they're doing beautifully up there in northern Iraq right now, really flourishing, do they want to take some risks in terms of antagonizing the people in the neighborhood? But they'll argue for the best they can get out of the current constitution as it is reformed.
Just tell them to take notes from Texas. What I want to do is ask you, Jill, to take in the minute that we have left, just say a couple words about the university in Suleimania, American University in Iraq. I mean, most of us know about the American University in Beirut, the American University in Cairo. What is this other thing, and what might its future significance be? And you get 1 minute.
1 minute, that's a little bit tough, but let me tell you, the American
Well,
University.
two.
Oh, two, okay. The American University in Iraq in Suleimania was founded only about 8 or 9 years ago, so we're a new kid on the block. It's not been an easy, starting a new university isn't an easy thing to do, but we're doing very well now. We probably have about 1,000 students. And I want to tell you that one of the really inspirational things is when I'm over there and I'm visiting maybe with students, and you see these kids playing basketball or volleyball, or they're on the debate team, and they're Shia and Sunnis and they're Turkmen and they're Yazidis and they're Iranians, and it doesn't make any difference to them. They're all students together pursuing an education. So I want to say that. And to me, this is why I'm passionate about it, and why I love it. This is what education can be about, how it brings people together across those ethnic and religious lines that their parents may care a lot about. But the other thing I'd say about it is we see ourselves, because it's an American university, what that means is an American model. I mean, we're not part of America, it's a private university. But the American model is the 2 years broad education in liberal arts and humanities and the sciences and the social sciences, broad education, and then narrowing into a particular academic slot. But in the Middle East, those of you that know the Middle East, you know that most universities, and by the way, we compete because all universities are free in Iraq, and we have to charge because we're private, but in the Middle East, you start out right from your freshman year, you're going to be an engineer, you're going to be a doctor, and that's all you're trained in. So we see ourselves with this broad-based American model, really training critical thinkers. And we see ourselves as training the leaders of the region, as certainly AUB in Beirut has done, AUC, American University in Cairo, where my son taught for a while, as a matter of fact. They're training regional leaders. We see ourselves doing that. And we hold forums, we bring in great people, and these students ask great questions, and they can debate with people because we have this open forum, and it's freedom of speech. You get to say what you want. Tom Friedman was our graduation speaker. We're getting a lot of recognition now. People realize there's hope in this place where pulling together these different ethnicities, educating them well to think broadly and critically, and that's how we see our future, as training the future leaders of the whole Middle East.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thanks very much.